Hello, Not Manly here. Welcome back to Kerbal Space Program, where we're bringing out the cheat engines. We've got our Zephyrus turbofan engines that we are using as boosters for this test craft. Now, you might find it unusual to use jet engines as a booster, but we don't use jet engines as boosters on rockets on Kerbin, or on Earth for that matter. The difference is that Eve has an atmosphere that is 5 times as thick on the surface. And let me just explain a couple things about this so you know I'm not completely cheating over here. First off, rockets push craft through the air, whereas jets pull themselves through the air, dragging the craft along with them. Now, what does that mean when you got thicker air around you? Well, Eve's air is over 5 times as dense as it is on Kerbin. So you got more air to pull, you got more thrust. So how do you figure this out? Well, I tried out the Advanced Jet Engines mod for Kerbal Space Program, which uses NASA's engine sim code in real time, which accounts for speed and air density to calculate thrust. Let's take a look. This is our thrust curve for the Weasley jet engine, the Stock J33, and this is a similar thrust curve that I had measured for the AJE version, the CF34. They're very similar. So, what happens when I try to take the same jet engine and put it in thicker air? Well, most engines got more thrust. In general, thrust flattened out about twice or more air density, but specific impulse didn't change all that much. What I found out was that the CF38, the AJE version of the Weasley, flattened out at over 5 times the air density. So extending that for the stock J33 Weasley jet engine was pretty trivial. Now, what this means for explodium-breathing engines is that the J34 uses the extended curve, which means it gets a lot more thrust at really low Eve altitudes. Now, let's take a look at a very practical example here. Here's a normal Kerbal Space Program game with advanced jet engines installed, and that is the stock J33 Weasley being represented by a more realistic CF34 turbofan. Now, actually, the intake area on this craft is not enough to supply this engine, so I had to add these extra intake ramp over here. Now let's take a look at this. We will see this craft on Kerbin in a moment. Here it is. Let's take a look at the exact same craft, no other changes, on a world with over 12 times the air density. That's Tulumo. Look at that. Only seconds in, and it has more than enough lift to get off the ground. That thrust is just, it's ridiculous, actually. That is Tulumo from Galileo's Planet Pack. And it has a surface air density of 12 times that of Kerbin. And as you can see, it also has an oxygen atmosphere. And with that, the Weasley turbofan is just ridiculous. Or rather, the CF34 is. In fact, we're getting some control oscillations in there. The same craft back at Kerbin is still struggling to get off the runway. Meantime, this thing is just... oh, it's just all over the place. Now, before you think I'm cheating, though, on specific impulse, so we know that the thrust is good, but what about specific impulse? Let's take a stop right here. Take a look at those speeds. It's about the same speed, 163 meters per second, but if you look at those specific impulse values, there's like less than 3% of a difference in efficiency. There's over 7 times the air, but you got over 5 times the thrust, and we're not even at full throttle back at Tulumo. Look at that. That is just ridiculous, and that's using NASA's engine sim code, remember. So, we've got lots of thrust in really high densities. Landing, on the other hand, is a little harder on Tulumo than it is on Kerbin. Tulumo has twice the gravity, which is where it gets that thick air density from. And, well, just trying to land this thing in an air density that's very similar to Kerbin at a similar altitude, it didn't work out very well at all. Yep, and there we go. But hey, pretty powerful engine for what it is. So we come back to Eve. How are we going to then get this 22-ton monster up to low Eve orbit, let alone get up to Gilly? And that's what we got here. We've got a 22-ton base here, and we're going to try to get this up to low Eve orbit and then refuel it. We're going to use the very imaginatively named Purple X. If you recognize this design, well, it's very much like the stock Kerbal X. The only difference is we are using those Zephyrus turbofan engines as boosters to get the thing off the pad. And at 0.4 kilometers up, at 400 meters up, we have over 2-to-1 thrust to weight ratio here on Eve. It is just ridiculous. And as soon as we fix the staging on this craft, we're going to launch it up into space. At least I hope we're going to launch it up into space. There was a lot of staging that got broken by pasting in this subassembly. We got to make sure that your staging is correct. Check your staging. There we go. We match that engine with that decoupler and so on. We should be ready to launch. No, we're not ready to launch. And there we go. We're going to watch those oxidizer tanks carefully. When they approach zero, that's when we will detach them and ignite our main engines. The main ascent column of this consists of a single twin-bore engine and 6 Atom liquid fuel engines. Once we get this thing high enough up off the pad, and just as we run out of oxidizer, we will detach those Zephyrus turbofans and we will launch the actual engines. Look at that. But as you see, as the air density goes down, our thrust to weight goes down, and at some point we'll have to switch to the regular rockets. We do this now. We try to recover those, but nope. It's way too explosive. Bits and pieces hanging off by parachute. But hey, that's okay as long as they don't land on the launch pad. In the meantime, we'll get this craft the rest of the way up. Its thrust to weight has dropped to below 1, but as we expend fuel and get higher up, thrust to weight then increases back to over 1. And we try to do a normal gravity turn, trying to get this thing up to orbit. With Eve's higher gravity, this requires a lot of thrust, and so I save that entire column of 7 engines up to the very end. Then we finally switch to the mainsail liquid fuel engine, which KSP players all over the world love and know. I use the mainsail to give this thing the biggest push that I can. In fact, I have to enable cross-feed on that decoupler to try and use the next stage's fuel tank if I can. I find I don't quite have enough thrust. But once I think we're high enough up and fast enough, I detach it and we go to the most efficient engine that we've got, the Poodle liquid fuel engine. In the 2.5 meter configuration, the Poodle liquid fuel engine is very efficient. It generates electricity for us. And it just finishes to close this uncrewed base. We'll detach that nose cone and then finish closing our orbit. Look at that. Now we've just got over 900 meters per second delta V in here, but if we can get this thing out to Gilly, it has a full mining suite aboard. It has a single small ore tank. It has radiators to dissipate heat. It has lots of little extendable solar panels so that we got enough power to run those drills and run that in situ resource utilization device. Now getting it out to Gilly, we're going to send up a tanker, and we're also going to send up this base's crew. Samvi, Lizzle, and Nadalov Kerbin are on their way to rendezvous with the base. What we're going to do is we're going to get this into orbit, dock with the base, refuel the base, and then load it up with crew. We'll fill the seats in that science lab, and we'll have an engineer to watch over the mining and ISRU. Once again, using those Zephyrus jet engines to get off the pad and high enough for the main rockets to take over. And well, that didn't work out so hot either. Bits and pieces. We'll try to recover those some other way later. As long as we don't break the launch pad, that's okay for now. We've got a contract, in case you're wondering why we're doing this. C7 Aerospace has asked us to send a base to Gilly, but they've asked that base also have 2,000 units of liquid fuel. Now, there's no way we're just going to haul 2,000 units of liquid fuel. We'll just mine it on Gilly. Well, assuming we can get this thing to orbit. Whoops, watch out, we had the wrong display mode there. There we go. Now we're back in orbit mode. Assuming that we can get this thing to Gilly, we should be able to mine for the fuel that we need and then complete the contract. At the same time, we've got a science lab aboard there. We'll be able to make some science on our way to Gilly, and of course when we actually get there. There we go. I had to use the same trick to give the mainsail engine a little more fuel. Come on. We are not quite orbital yet. We're still suborbital. We've got a lot of speed to pick up yet. I'm a little worried there we might not have enough fuel to do this, and let alone get to Gilly. Oh, there we go. Now we are in orbit. Now we're slightly behind the base, so it makes more sense to switch back to the base and have it do the rendezvous with our crew craft. A little less expensive too, only a 45 meter per second maneuver. And here is the base in all of its extended glory, rendezvousing with our crew craft and tanker. So we can thank our explodium-breathing engines, especially that Zephyrus turbofan engine, for making it possible to get 2.5 meter assemblies up into low Eve orbit. Otherwise, we've got just our basic docking here. Not a problem. Just amazing. To be able to get to Gilly, we need about 1300 meters per second just to get there, and about 300 to close our orbit, assuming that our rendezvous is almost perfect. Hopefully, when we dock this craft and unload all of its fuel, it will have enough Delta V for the job. It can always mine the rest of the fuel that it needs. Come on. And there we go. I turned SAS off to let the craft settle on its own. We don't want shaking it to pieces. Once it's settled, we re-enable SAS and we transfer over our fuel. Now this craft does have the basic monopropellant that's on that Mark 1-2 crew cabin, so all we needed to do was to add the RCS thruster blocks. Now that craft can stay in low Eve orbit. We could leave it in orbit and do some surveys. Look at that. We've got the Probodobodine Rove mate on there. We can use CurbNet on there. Maybe there are some anomalies to find on the surface of Eve. Again, we can use this to pick up stranded purples. We could use the RCS to deorbit this craft and return any crew if necessary. And there we go. Back at the main craft, we have just under 1800 meters per second Delta V. If we are thrifty with our maneuvers, we should be able to land this craft on Gilly. There we go, Natlov Kerman taking command of this craft with the assistance of the Probodobodine HECS probe. 1300 meters per second just. That should leave us enough for maneuvers and for closing our orbit. Now let's bundle this craft up, get ready for our ejection burn out to Gilly. Just using the basic action groups in our level 2 vehicle assembly building, we can at least turn groups of objects on and off without having to individually do so. So I tie the legs to those service bays and I tie everything else to the lights. There we go. Good luck, Nadalor, if you're going to need it. We come pretty close. We're not quite getting a Gilly encounter yet, though. But that's okay. We'll try to set up a maneuver later. 73 meters per second. That's going to be pretty expensive. I don't think I want to spend that this far away from Gilly. However, if I can get the craft close enough to Gilly, closing that orbit should not be expensive at all. Let's find out. Whoop, we don't want to crash on Gilly. Okay, 237 meters per second. That we should have enough to cover that. I do end up picking a much earlier maneuver, though, that costs only 13 meters per second. After executing that particular burn, though, we'll check back toward Gilly and see what our insertion burn over there is going to cost. Okay, we're roughly on course. Good, 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 good. One last check to make sure that we're good to go. We've got 450 meters per second there, and we need 247. That'll leave us with enough delta V to land, I hope. We'll find out if it's enough. Until then, I'm not Manly. Fly safe.